hear me? I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm one of your hosts today. Thank you for joining us. We've got a whole pile of people still dribbling in as the afternoon goes on, including a couple of speakers. So if you see a seat at the front, move down so they can come in at the back. Please, if I can. Those people standing in particular, there are seats at the front here. Welcome to the Climate Bonds North America's conference. I'm here first to introduce my friend Colin Diamond, who's a partner in White & Case, who are our hosts today in this fabulous location. I can see the Hudson over there. It's very cool. First to welcome us, please, Colin, come on up.
Thank you, Sean. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. I'm Colin Diamond. I'm a partner at White & Case. It seems as if we've decided that the initial speakers should all come from England. I don't know if that theme is going to be continued. How lucky we all are. On behalf of White & Case, I want to welcome all of you here today for this very important and timely seminar. I also want to welcome the 1,400 participants who have joined us online from around the world. Thank you, Climate Bonds Initiative, for inviting us to partner with you in hosting this event in our offices today. Based on data from the S&P, at the end of Q3, green, social, sustainability, and sustainability-linked bonds comprised 12% of total funds raised in global bond offerings this year. And sustainability-linked bonds grew their share of that market meaningfully. And as you know, and you'll find out more about today, Climate Bonds Initiative is calling for green bond issuances to reach an annual $5 trillion by 2025 to fight climate change. So we have a lot of work to do. White & Case has been involved in sustainable financing from its inception, having advised the Republic of Poland on one of the first green bond issuances by a sovereign back in 2017. And we remain at the forefront of recent innovations in sustainable finance. We acted as the sole knowledge partner to the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group and advised the Bank of England as chair of the G20 Green Finance Study Group in this role, and we co-authored the G20 White Paper on Sustainable Finance. Conferences like this are critical. As a capital markets lawyer, I know that the SEC is scrutinizing disclosures related to green and sustainability-linked bonds. The SEC recently commented to one of our clients that even if green funds are only raised from institutional investors, the SEC expects the issuer to fully explain to its public stockholders what its green finance framework is. There will be further SEC scrutiny as issuers make these types of disclosures. We all need to be at the cutting edge of practice and developments, and this conference will enable all of us to do just that. So thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to an engaging afternoon with all of you.
Thank you so much, Colin, and thank you again for hosting us today in this really very nice location spot. Next, we're going to have a short video message from Jane Fraser, the CEO of Citibank, our lead sponsor for today.
Thank you, Sean, and on behalf of Citi, I'm delighted to join you in welcoming everyone to Climate Bonds Initiative Connect 2022. And this year's event comes at a defining moment, a year of intense weather, including summer heat waves and wildfires across the globe, has once again highlighted the urgency of the climate crisis. Yet, the war in Ukraine and its impacts on the global energy supply have further complicated the transition to a low-carbon economy. At Citi, our determination is as strong as ever. We believe that global financial institutions like ours have the opportunity and indeed the responsibility to play a leading role in confronting climate change. We have engaged in these efforts for many years, putting in place the foundations to help our clients achieve net zero. And today, there's an additional S in ESG, and that's security. And our efforts are helping corporates and communities build resiliency and sustainability in combating climate change. Earlier this year, we released our initial plan for achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Given the size and the breadth of Citi's portfolios and businesses, reaching net zero, it's a Herculean undertaking. What does it mean? It means rolling up our sleeves and working with our clients to embed the transition into every aspect of our work. The transition won't look the same for all of our clients, and that's why we're engaging client by client and sector by sector. Where the solutions are known, renewable energy, for example, we must facilitate scale and widespread adoption. And where solutions are less clear and more difficult to define, such as in agriculture or heavy industry and other high-emitting sectors, we must discover climate-friendly alternatives to business as usual, all with the goal of reaching cost parity as quickly as possible. The financial sector can help unleash the capital and put companies on the path to net zero, but strong government policy and technological advance are critical to driving change at scale. Thankfully, we have great partners, such as Climate Bonds, which has been such a champion for public-private sector collaboration, and which has consistently delivered cutting-edge solutions and provided clear, ambitious, science-based standards to support the transition. Confronting one of the biggest challenges of our time is not going to be easy, but out of collaboration and cooperation come hope and progress. Thank you and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Citi, for the support you've shown in this program. I want to say a few words by way of scene setting and context, if I may, before we start on our first panel, which will be around greening the municipal bond market. And we have speakers in the room from all our panels, so thank you for joining us today. You kind of know what the context is, the challenge here. And this is our first North American US Climate Bonds Conference. We've run these in Singapore, in London for many years, in Mexico City as well. The US market has been a little bit slow in this particular approach of mobilizing capital for climate solutions, making visible to the investor in a way they can report to their beneficiaries the nature of investments that help address climate solutions. This is changing a bit. I mean, the US dollar market is still very large, but a lot of that is seeded by international institutions, the World Banks of the world. We've seen some muni stuff. We've seen a few leading corporate issuers such as Apple or Southern Energy or the like, but we think the scope to grow this, we think we need to grow this, and we know that investors are interested. I've got a weird reverb. Are you getting the audio out there okay? Thank goodness. Let's just step back for a minute. Why has this thematic market started? Well, it started with a growing appreciation amongst asset owners of the kinds of challenges we face. You know, at a time when we face still substantial social challenges, addressing inequality, addressing healthcare issues. You know, this is a country where 2/3 of all bankruptcies are because of healthcare bills. This is an unfortunate, difficult situation. Challenges around education policy. We have this other crisis. It's like a freight train on the tracks coming down towards us, which is climate change. I've just come back from the climate change conference, the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. And I would say one key learning is that we have lost the fight against climate change. We no longer can stop climate change at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Just to be clear, we now have baked in 1.8, probably 2 degrees, and we have to prepare for that. That doesn't mean our target should change. The 1.5 degree target is still absolutely necessary. I've had lots of approaches by governments and corporations saying, well, look, we're not going to get to 1.5. What about we now aim for 2? The carbon budget for 2 degrees is 3 times the carbon budget for 1.5. We've actually got to go in the reverse direction. Ideally, we should be increasing our reduction in emissions just to give us a shot at stabilising climate impacts and temperatures going forward. So the 1.5 degrees is absolutely the target, but realistically, in terms of how we will feel the impacts of climate change, expect this to go to 2 degrees and hopefully come back down as we get on top of massive, large-scale reforestation, of direct air capture technologies and so on, which will help us stabilise the climate. And there's a lot of R&D going on in that area. There are some interesting developments, such as Occidental's announcement a few weeks ago that it's now starting commercial direct air capture and sequestration, thanks to a US tax credit, if I remember correctly, around carbon sequestration. There are hopeful signs in that area. But do understand we've lost the fight. We have lost the fight. Emissions grew 6% globally last year. They need to be reducing 8% per annum on average across the planet to meet the IPCC's, not target, the IPCC's statement of minimal reductions we have to achieve, which is 50% reductions globally by 2030. 2030, guys, that's a few short years away. And if we don't reach that, we essentially face catastrophe. So we need to understand the fight on mitigation on emissions now is a fight to avoid utter catastrophe, not a fight to stop climate change. Of course, that utter catastrophe is extremely grim. The last time we had significant climate change was the 1600s. We had global cooling of 2 degrees. It now looks like the reason why that happened, according to research at Stanford University, was because of reforestation in the Americas. Kind of hopeful in a way. Essentially, we killed off so many American Indians in the 1500s. Something like 95% of the population of the Americas died from measles and smallpox, largely, that we saw large reforestation in Central America and South America. So much reforestation that we suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Whoa! It's sort of hopeful, isn't it? Not very helpful for American Indians. The set off a few feedback loops. From research at Mauna Loa recently, we now know that changing rainfall patterns dramatically, big dumps of rain, sets off volcanic eruptions. In the 1600s, we had a number of very severe volcanic eruptions, which led to a bit like nuclear winters, years without sun, and therefore famine. The experience of the rest of the world in the period 1600 to 1700, captured beautifully in a book by Cambridge historian Geoffrey Parker called The Global Climate Crisis, was an experience of war, famine, and pandemic. It wasn't freezing ice in the Thames, although the Thames did freeze over a few times in the 1600s, and similar reports happened all around the world of cold incidents. But in the practice of it is pandemics. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been telling us since 1990 that we face a 21st century of regular pandemics because of the impacts of climate change. The last pandemic was a collapse of biodiversity in southern China and ASEAN, pathogen dumping between species, etc. Actually, human impact, fundamentally. We now face the release of pathogens from thawing ice in Siberia and Canada, as the latest science journals are talking about, and so on. Hey, it's coming, folks. Prepare. That's a resilience activity. Organising PPE gear to be made available locally in the UK or the US or Brazil is a climate resilience activity now, because these are the impacts of climate change. War, well, we don't have a climate war yet, do we? But we do have let me think about this, a fossil fuel kleptocrat using fossil fuel revenues from Europe to invade a neighbour. Sort of vaguely related, isn't it? We'll see more of these going forward, I'm afraid. And we will see famine. We had very close brush with famine this last year as a result of skyrocketing prices thanks to the war in Ukraine. Let's call that a collateral effect of a fossil fuel-related war. And that'll happen again. In 2010, we saw the collapse of Russian wheat production thanks to severe heat incidences in the steppes of Russia. Russia banned exports of wheat that year. So it wasn't a war, it was a climate incident. As a result, the price of wheat in particular quadrupled in a whole bunch of countries that are not hedged. And those countries were places like Tunisia, Libya, Syria, and Egypt. The way ordinary people experienced the impact of climate change was a revolution. And we're still dealing with the consequences of those that went rather haywire in Syria and Libya, etc. And the jury is certainly still out in Egypt and Tunisia. You can sort of see what we're actually going to experience here. It posits a few areas of resilience that we need to address while we are on this race to get emissions down to avoid utter catastrophe. And remember that what I'm talking about in these examples, these are givens. These are not prospects. If we are successful in getting emissions down by 2030, we still certainly, I need some help with the audio. There's a terrible reverb. Thank you. We still certainly face climate change, which is going to get worse for 30 years. The emissions that we put into the atmosphere in 1990 created the climate impacts that we're feeling now, because there's a sort of 30-year latency effect in climate systems. In the last 30 years since then, we have put more emissions into the atmosphere than the previous 150 years. Yikes. That kind of means that even if we stop emissions stone cold dead tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we've got 30 years of increasingly ugly weather and all the other aspects of it to deal with. So that's given. So all these impacts, these severe impacts on our societies, our economies, and our peoples around the world are things that are going to happen, not things that could happen. The issue now is if we can avoid catastrophic climate change and avoid, look, a future that I'm dubious the human species can survive. It certainly can't survive with the civilization we have now. Most senior climate scientists I talk to are pretty bleak. I can remember speaking to one professor of physics and also climate science who recently retired, who said to me when I asked him what he thought of the future, "Sean, I don't think my kids have a future." There's an epidemic of depression amongst climate scientists because they've been, there's a long article in the British Medical Journal a few years ago about it, because they've been telling us for 30 years the prescription hasn't changed and we have not been taking action. We've been saying, oh, that sounds really bad. Whoa, okay, what about we just do this? Will that be okay? And that's what our national climate change plans are, and clearly they haven't been okay. Catastrophe this century is something that will see us losing at least as many people as we lost in the 1600s in that climate incidents. A third of the world's population died between 1600 and 1700 from war, famine, and pandemic linked to climate impacts. That's only a few short centuries ago. We can expect similar kinds of impacts. Now, it is possible we could construct this global society to avoid that kind of loss. That would require us to learn to cooperate while we don't cooperate. It would require us to avoid stealing PPE equipment from the tarmac of Bangkok in the middle of a pandemic, as a juicy president, of course, authorized. Collaboration, cooperation to deal with global crisis will become a necessity whatever happens. And the better we can do it, the more likely we are to survive the worst of the crises coming forward. It starts with increasing the budget and the authority of organisations like the World Health Organization, so that when a pandemic breaks out in Wuhan, they actually have the legal right pre-agreed to go in there and investigate. That's an example of one of the things we have to sort out for the future. But it applies on everything. It does require all major economies to join international apparatus, including the US, that's resisted, as you know, in many areas, like the International Treaty on the Seas, etc. There's a lot to be done on the global infrastructure. This will be a test for us as a species. In a sense, we've created a test of adulthood. Will we shift from being juveniles, wandering around, wrecking the planet in our extraction of resources and ignoring future consequences, to adult stewards of the planet that we need to be. That's the test. We may fail. I probably wouldn't take a bet on us winning at the moment if I was a rational person, but I continue to be hopeful that we can make them. And I'm going to say I continue to be hopeful because of the fact that we've created these institutions that have long-term assets and liabilities matching requirements that are required by their fiduciary duty, their DNA, to look over the horizon in a way our congressional leaders, our corporate leaders have not been. Institutional investors who are leading, by the way, the interest in thematic finance. Let's see if we can harness this idea we've created that we have institutional setups to look 40 years down the track to counter the short-termism that's led us to the problems we're in now. That, I think, is the opportunity we have in front of us. But look, before I go too much down the rabbit hole of bad news, let me share with you some good news. The good news is we do have institutional investors. In fact, we've been extraordinarily successful on this planet at creating pools of capital in the last 15 years. And this is at a time when McKinsey said in a report in January that to address the climate crisis, we need to be investing something like $9.2 trillion a year, every year, year out, just in mitigation. About 2/3 of that is reorienting existing flows, changing procurement guidelines for energy or transport or water infrastructure, that sort of stuff, to make sure it's future fit. But about 1/3 of that is new CapEx. Think of solar farm versus a gas plant. Much higher CapEx, but lower OpEx. So we've got a capital lump we've got to get over. We've also got on the resilience side of things about a 50% capital load on top of that. But again, a big chunk of that is reorienting capital flows, ensuring water infrastructure has taken into account future changes in our environment, society. To give you an example, the Thames Gateway in London, which stops severe flooding in London, great little project done of a levy on property owners by the Thames, unfortunately was built without adaptation planning. As a result, it'll be breached sometime in the next 10 years unless a new gateway is built further downstream, as is currently being planned. If you like, the people who did the planning were negligent because they failed to take into account forward climate change, and therefore the lifespan of that particular asset is going to be about half of what it should be because it wasn't built high enough, etc. That's what I mean by changing procurement guidelines. And that's what the resilience side of things is going to be very much part of it. But while we have this large CapEx need, we do have these pools of capital. We, in fact, have a savings glut. So much so that The Economist a few weeks ago talked about the extent of the savings glut driving long-term interest rates and predicted that while we've got a spike in interest rates now, the long-term trend will see a continuing reduction in at least fixed income interest rates. Interesting hypothesis. That particular pool of capital has shown it wants green. It started off in the ESG space and equities. In the fixed income space, we've now seen the growth, as you heard from Colin earlier, about thematic issuance, so that the green and social and sustainable bond market has gone from about $3 billion when we started to $3 trillion outstanding now. While we've got a dip in global fixed income issuance everywhere, the share going to thematic continues to grow. In Asia, ex-Japan, for example, last year, 25% of corporate bond issuers were thematic in some way. This year already, it's 33%. Similar kind of change in Europe. So that's good news. We see significant continuing increase in demand, not reduction in demand. Well, we'll hear from some of the asset owners and asset managers a little later on the panel as whether I'm talking out of my hat or whether there's some truth in that. But that's what we're seeing. So that's good news. We are now seeing, rather late to the party, governments beginning to act. Now, the Biden Climate Summit last year saw all the major Western economies commit to 2030 targets, not 2050, but 2030, which is what counts, according to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, i.e., we have to front-load the change, not back-load it. Critically important issue here. Now, are they going to get there? Are the targets enough? I think there's room to argue on all those fronts. But, from an investor perspective, it's pretty hard to avoid the fact that every single major economy has now committed to 2030 targets, or there's a reasonable chance change is coming. In fact, I would argue there's a tsunami of change coming through. We've already seen the fruits of active government change in the last 20 years. The reason we have cheap solar now is because the German government in 2001, the Greens Labour government, introduced the feed-in tariff, and that took off in Europe. And then from 2006, the Chinese copied large-scale offtake agreements for solar. Those two decisions started a drastic reduction because the production volumes of solar went up, the unit cost went down. It wasn't R&D in the US, it was offtake agreements. By the way, those offtake agreement models have been used in the US in the past, in the 50s, to grow electricity generation. It's a known idea. And of course, the fruits of that now, well, I had a chat with the CEO of Aqua, the Middle Eastern Saudi energy company, about 2 weeks ago, who told me that they're going to be building solar in Saudi Arabia this coming year at 1 cent a kilowatt hour. If any of you know about energy prices, that is extraordinary. I've still got feed-in tariff contracts in India signed 7 years ago that are paying out 30 cents a kilowatt hour. Like, whoa, that's what you call a learning curve. And of course, the flow-on effect of that is hydrogen. We now see green hydrogen. I've had major industrialists on our webinars talk about delivering green hydrogen at $1.50 or even 97 cents a kilo in the next 2 to 3 years. These are Biden hydrogen moonshot prices, and so on and so on. But let me be clear. The reason those things have happened has been because of strong state action. We don't make this change that we need to make with the speed with simply markets, with simply corporations, with simply investors. We need to have a close working collaboration between the capital, between the people who are going to deliver, and governments who can provide the policy setting, the direction, the incentives like the IRA and various other measures to be able to make this change. Our lives, the lives of our children depend on this. There's the other good news too, which is regulators have started to act. The SEC, rather late to the party, it's because you had a bit of a problematic president for a while. But we've seen the Network for the Greening of the Financial System, with now 110 central banks as a member. The US Fed applied to join that association 3 days after the election where the presidency changed last time, I note. And that's doing great work and driving change at a regulatory level all around the world. So there is stuff happening. Of course, finance is not the end game. Finance is the enabler of real-world change. When we talk about green finance and green bonds, we need to be highly cognizant of what has to happen in industry. Transitions is a big theme for us, and you hear a little bit about that today. Urban development. We are shifting from a world where 56% of people live in cities to, we believe, 80% will live in cities by 2050. That requires to think about sustainable, wealth-creating, viable cities everywhere around the world, especially in emerging markets where we have been building a string of cities with 20 million people in them, and there's more coming through. And then, of course, nature. We are, as you know, in the midst of the 6th great extinction. This is the first extinction that's been created by a living species on the planet, us. We see extraordinary figures. For example, of 60,000 known tree species in the world, 20,000 are either endangered or about to become endangered, according to the international bodies in the area. What are we doing? What are we doing? Our ability to have a resilient planet depends on a resilient ecosystem. So addressing biodiversity is not an intrinsic value in its own right. It is, but it's critical to our ability to create a planet that can survive, to create a world that will survive the crisis we are inflicting upon it, with the volatility in weather and other matters that is going to become the norm of the 21st century. A lot to do. For investors, there's a bit of a prescription now. I'm going to say, for investors, we need to do more faster. Hey, I'm going to say that to everyone, you know that. But investors have a particular opportunity. that they can engage. They can engage not just on their direct shareholdings, which is, of course, the first and most important thing. You want the future, the risks that are coming through in your portfolio to be addressed by your portfolio. You want your shareholdings to get their act together to make sure there's less chance of default going forward. These are understandable, sensible things. We can learn from ESG. We'll hear from York Kell later on. He's thinking on that. But we also need to bear in mind that portfolio shuffling is not an adequate solution. Portfolio shuffling ends up being shifting deck chairs in the Titanic. We need to make sure the Titanic shifts direction. We need to ensure there's a rising tide if we are to have a future for our kids. That means we've got to band together in things like the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance or the Climate Action 100 Plus or the various other associations that have wonderfully formed in the last few years. Even GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, for all its problems, is a great initiative. Working together to figure out the larger scale changes that will ensure that Titanic shifts direction is the task of the decade. For banks, green business development, it will require us, it is requiring, as you heard Jane Fraser talk about it earlier, to invest in longer-term pipeline development than we are normally used to. We can't be stuck with 3 month and 6 months delivery deadlines. We're going to have to invest in 1 year and 2 year pipeline development, which is a challenge. But if we do it, we'll be banks for the future. If we don't do it, we are likely to be swept aside as a tsunami of deals come through. Well, that's my positing. Every bank has to make a decision. But there is no doubt helping our clients transition needs to be the mantra of every single bank on the planet from now on. And of course, advisors, pathways, everyone needs pathways to the kind of organisation they are going to be. Pathways to low emissions, pathways to resilience, and of course, pathways to profit through all of that. Hey, I need my pension fund to pay me out in a few years' time. So I need sustainability of returns as well as sustainability for the planet. That's where the consultants and advisors come in. Just remember, it's 2030 that counts, not 2050. We need 2050 targets, but front load the change if we're going to make this transition. And then governments. It's time for us to plan. It's time for industrial planning, which is, of course, what the IRA essentially is, a form of. Every government in the world needs to wrestle. It has to wrestle for a couple of reasons. One is it's got emissions targets, hopefully taking them seriously, as the US government currently is. But also risk. We do have these changes coming through. We do have a global economy thanks to strong action by Europe, by the US, by China. I'm happy to talk about that later if you want to. We do a lot of work in China. And in India coming through. That will change the nature of the world economy. I can tell you in Latin America, we're having conversations around commodities and what's changing. It will no longer be fossil fuels in 10 years. It'll be the lithiums of the world and the rare earths. Hey, plan now. Get the infrastructure built. Get those mines going, and so on and so on. Every country needs to be looking at this. Mexico needs to change its auto parts industry, all entirely reliant on fossil fuel cars at the moment. They're not going to be around in 10 years. It's got to change, and so on. You see what's got to happen. What's going to happen? To finish up, next, you will see greater clarity about what we need to do. You've seen the work we've been doing on called taxonomies in some countries, green produce catalogues. You'll see more work on that around what are credible and plausible transition pathways, what are enabling investments, what are resilience investments that are required, not just physical, but social, educational, ecosystem investments. That will happen. It's already in place. It's coming. That gives us a playbook we can all play to. You will see much more in the way of tilting. The removal of negative subsidies, we continue to see good news about, but more to the point, the growth of positive incentives, tax breaks, public procurement. New Zealand is looking at the idea of applying its green produce catalogue to all public procurement. So every ministry has to argue if it's not buying according to their green produce catalogue or taxonomy, why? There has to be a reason. That's something every government could do, large-scale contributors to the economies. And of course, risk mitigation, blended finance, changes and so on, a big part of it. But above all, the third thing you will see in many countries, I'm waiting to see in the US, but in many countries, like Denmark's doing at the moment, is pipeline development. What we need now in this next 2 years is a kind of global mad scramble to plan our future, to plan a different
Recording in
future.
progress.
The Danish government is having a ministry by ministry change in rethink about what they're doing. They're developing the world's largest offshore wind farms, which they say will contribute something like up to 40% of Europe's electricity in peak times. Extraordinary amount of electricity, extraordinary amount of wind farms. They've done deals with the unions to take what are currently gas workers into the wind energy industry. And now they're in the process of mapping out a capital raising plan over the next 5 years to do it. Hey, everyone can do that. Everyone needs to do that, from corporations to cities, municipalities to governments. Whatever, this will grow. The only question, while the shape of the future has been decided, is the speed of change. We, of course, are here to see how fast we can drive this loco. We needed to drive very quickly. Thank you for being here today, and thank you most importantly for participating, for being part of what is an incredibly privileged position in society in this grand endeavour to redefine, to rethink, to rebuild our future.